No, it's all good. It's all good. So I'm just going to speak briefly about some of the background that led up to the Creative Leadership Book Club. So just before I dive into the slide, a bit about myself. So I head up the Arts and Culture program at the university. So there's a small team of us, and we're responsible for delivering the arts and culture strategy. And what that means is supporting the creative work of the university and building bridges with the creative and cultural sector in Devon and Cornwall. And that takes lots of different forms. And I think for the context of today, one of the really important aspects is that we do align ourselves with the big three banner priorities for the university. So social justice is the Faculty of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences priority, which is where we're housed. And as it happens, it's also something that I'm very committed to and interested in. So just co-creating, we're going back a little bit. So this is from our annual report for 21-22. And in the education incubator at the time was an academic called Sarah Dyer, who's now at Manchester. And we found we had a common interest. We're both very interested in social justice and particularly racial equity and addressing the racism issues at the university, as well as broader conversations around the consequences of colonization and decolonization processes. And we're also really interested in design thinking. So design thinking being a structured technique to creative problem solving. So it's really about how through doing, it's very action oriented, how through doing people can bring about change. And also because through this design thinking process, it can be a really energizing, generative process. And I'd sort of found in the anti-racism space, it can sometimes feel quite extractive and certainly exhausting for those who've lived experience to be having to, not having to, but more often than not, having to sort of relive or draw up individual personal experiences as a way to illustrate points and working within these complicated systems. So we were thinking, how could we bring this design thinking process that we see as being a positive action-oriented thing together with the anti-racism work? That was the sort of springboard. And that led us to try this Just Co-Creating project. So our two key questions here are about how might we employ design thinking and co-design to support the work of improving racial equality and inclusion at the university, and then how can we co-create in a just way? And that question really came about because through doing preparation into this project and talking with a bunch of folks, what came up was even design needs decolonizing. So I had, in my ignorance, thought of it as a fairly benign thing. It was I sort of felt like design in the wrong hands does harm, but otherwise it's an inert process and it depends on who's applying it. But actually, a lot of design thinking and design structures come out of the global north, sort of thinking about kind of modernist traditions and all the sort of dominance of sort of 20th century approaches. And you do still have, even though it's a very collective process, there is still something that can be quite gendered about the approach to design as well as racialized. And so that gave us pause for thought. So it's like, okay, how can we employ this, but without actually perpetuating its shortcomings? And so we worked with two external facilitators, Michaela Lewis from Kingston University and Asan Khan, who runs a freelance company, Climate Labs. And we prioritize staff who are either doing anti-racism work, and because it's part of their roles, or actually they're bringing their own lived experience and interest in the work to what the university is doing, but it's almost voluntary. It's really kind of giving their time to these projects above and beyond the day job. And honestly, this project, I've never known, I've been doing projects for like 20 years. I've never known a project to be beset with so many things beyond our control. We were trying to do this in COVID times. We had people on the team who had chronic health issues, and so and there were train strikes, and I mean, like, you name it, you could not have actually made up the sort of bad star energy that we were fighting against the whole way, which made it, you know, really quite challenging, because what we wanted to get was some momentum. So and we learned a lot, but didn't have the traction that we wanted. So next slide, please. What we had done is a lot of learning and thinking and into the process, and we tried a few things out. And so the following year, 22-23, we decided that what would be a good idea is to really team up with the EDI team. And because of that expertise, but also the ownership over the Race Equality Charter Action Plan. And we thought, well, we've got our little thing over here. The best thing to do is to feed into a much broader initiative and do something more systematic. Meanwhile, V. Dewey, I had met because she was leading a decolonizing design project at the Royal Society for the Arts, and she was working at the Royal College of Art with a very influential designer, Rama Garawo, who heads up the Helen Hamlin Centre for Design. Now, Rama's particular passion is inclusive design. So what that means is, rather than designing for white, cis, able-bodied males, and then everything else is a sort of weird bolt-on at the edge, the approach of inclusive design is like, well, that's just not good design. If it's inclusive and you think about the broadest possible use, actually you're making a better design project, because more people can engage with it freely without having to kind of work through a process of adaptations. And at the centre, they had 4 priorities. I will not remember all of them. The ones I do remember are age, physical ability, race, and I can't remember what the 4th one was. I'm not going to make it up. So then it was the incubator and the EDI team and arts and culture, and we came together and we're like, great, Rama has created this thing called creative leadership, which Caitlin will talk about more in a moment. But it really seemed to kind of tap into all the stuff that we've been exploring through bringing together design thinking and anti-racism work in a way that we felt was really empowering for the people who were doing this work. This isn't just about leadership at the top, it's about those skills of leadership and how you can employ them in every role. And so with them, we commissioned some background work and a workshop, and then a couple of follow-up sessions that happened in the first term of, could it be this year? No, 23-24. Yeah. Yes. And so it was in June 23. We had this really successful workshop on the Streatham campus, a mix of staff and students. And we didn't do as much of the design thinking as I would have liked, but there were some really interesting conversations happened in the room, and we're bringing folk together across the institution in a way that I thought was really helpful. And one of the exercises that we did in there in pairs was, or small groups, was just a bit of brainstorming. We had some templates that Rama and V made available to us to sort of think about, okay, how do we enact this creative leadership? How do we turn it from just words into what might we do? And there had been an example given about, by Rama, about a book club that had been set up. And so Beau and I were chatting about this, and it really appealed to both of us, the opportunity. But what we wanted to do was to move away from the idea of a different book each month, because I think sometimes with that, I mean, sometimes I can get through a book a month, sometimes no chance. It also depends on what life is doing. And so we thought, well, wouldn't it be great to sort of sit with this idea of creative leadership and use the book as a touch point so that we're regularly returning to it, and that can provide a focus. And so because it was the end of the year, I had a little bit of wiggle room, and I could buy a whole bunch of these things so that we could give them out to staff and students. And yes, there it is, the book itself and the man himself. So we had a pile of these books, and we could get them out into people's hands, and then that really became the focus for the work that was building on these previous conversations. So hopefully that gives a bit of a sense. And Caitlin, shall I hand over to yourself?
Yes. And I will say that I'm aware that the whole of EduExe is open to people from both within and outside of Exeter. So Caitlin and Sandra, I don't know if you actually are at Exeter or elsewhere, which you are welcome to share, we'll have a little chat here in a bit. So everything I'm about to cover is what we tried to do to bring people in and to have this. And I think we had some successes and some, I don't want to say failures, but maybe not successes. And what we really would like to know is from people both inside and outside the institution, you know, do you have any experiences with this that could help inform? If you are from Exeter, like, does this kind of sit with what you know about our folks, or if you're from outside, what would have worked better in your context? So as you see the following few slides, you can kind of keep that in mind. So what we did, you can see here on screen. Sorry, I can also see all of your pictures are right on top of it. So let me move that a little bit. Yeah, so basically we had a total of 7 different meetings, and we started off by having something that covered our 3 campuses so that we had a chance to bring together the people who were interested and actually give them the book so they could start reading it. And then we had this grand plan, which we then ended up changing a little bit with our timing, because we were thinking we're going to do split it roughly into kind of an introduction and then 3 different things. And then we're going to kind of come together after that and think about how we're going to action what we've just done. And that is kind of how it fell out, but kind of slightly different. So you can see that we did have basically 3 rough sections of the book, but we repeated one for reasons that I will make clear in a moment. We had one meeting where basically nobody came, and so the 3 of us just kind of put our heads together and we were like, what are we doing? And then spontaneously, we made this decision to change up the final session to try to help us move from reading into action. And so we had brought in some groups, some student groups from campus who were doing more active projects to kind of learn from them and help maybe show how these things can connect from what you're reading to what you're actually doing. So that was what that looked like. And we kind of started off with this idea of having a bit more time in between each session so you could read. And then, to be honest, nobody was really reading, so it kind of didn't matter. But also we wanted to try to get a little bit more momentum, so we started having them a bit more regularly after the new year. So the book is a very nice short book, very accessible. I mean, the font is tiny, so it's not accessible in that way, but it's very light in terms of how much text there is, but heavy in terms of how much is actually in there. So it's a really nice blend. And there are 3 different kind of main points to the idea of creative leadership. And empathy, I actually have this animated, there we go. Empathy, clarity, and creativity in that order. And so that was roughly the order in which we wanted to chunk up the book. So there were a couple of chapters up front that introduced the ideas, and then there are 3 chapters, like 2 or 3 chapters associated with each one of those concepts, and then kind of an ending. And so that was how we wanted to split out the book. So we roughly, kind of speaking, were trying to talk about empathy and then clarity and then creativity in that order. So what we actually ended up doing, so Sarah has already mentioned, we did give a free book to everyone, kind of in the hopes that that would, first of all, that people are likely to sign up to stuff if there's something free, but also if it's a barrier that people can't actually access it, we wanted to get rid of that barrier. So we did want to make sure that that wouldn't hinder folks from coming. As I mentioned in that first session, because we have 3 campuses, we didn't want anyone to feel left out. And so we did actually have people on site for each, at each campus for that first meeting to try to get that kind of community spirit. But then we knew we couldn't necessarily keep doing that going forward. So subsequently, we did everything in a hybrid format online so that people could come in a room or be online as suited them. And what we really found, I think, as we went on was that the number of folks in the room did kind of gradually decrease. I mean, it gradually decreased in general, but in particular, I think we noticed that drop off in person because it was much easier for people to join online. We split out who led the different sessions, and so each of us sort of injected our own style, I think, to make that happen. So we had this different approach to how were we going to shape what the session looked like. Were we going to start with kind of an icebreaker activity where people were just kind of saying, oh, hey, I'm introducing myself, I might be new this week? Were we going to give people a chance to for example, play a little game that involved looking through the book and pulling something out that we could share that we liked, that we had read or maybe just seen on the day? Or were we going to do something completely random, like if you were an animal, what would you be? So we had kind of a range of things to try to pull people into the space and also create that feeling of a group. And I think when we first started, much more than towards the end, we did come in with certain questions that we were going to ask to try to facilitate discussion and prompt reflection in a certain instance. So I definitely had this long list of things and I was going to kind of go through sequentially. And then I think after that, because so many people kept coming and saying, I couldn't read the whole thing or I couldn't read it at all, and I just wanted to be here and absorb, we really changed that up so that we were thinking more about okay, well, I'm going to quickly kind of tell you what this week was about. We were talking about clarity. When have you seen clarity? Where have you seen clarity? How could clarity relate to whatever? So we were trying to make it much more that no matter what you had done, you could enter into that conversation and be a part of it and get something out of it and reflect on what do we do at Exeter or what could we do so that you can engage in that fashion. And I think a lot of it, a lot of the discussions were really sort of about engaging with these ideas just in general, because I think they came up again and again, you know, there is a Venn diagram for a reason, they're all related. And it was this idea of sort of thinking about at the university and in our practice, whether or not related to leadership or design or creativity, how can we become more kind of human in our approaches? So even where we were starting to go so far off the path that we weren't really talking about anything that he'd written in the book, we were trying to get that vibe that had come across. So it was much more about being full people and bringing that into our place of work. So this kind of concept that you can see on the screen, for example. This just quickly captures attendance, which I think, you know, I think it's good to have it up there, to be honest, because actually everything, and today is a really good example, everything that people have been putting on for the past several months, it's such a struggle. And there have been so many things that have been canceled, or they were going to be in person and they were moved online because nobody signed up, or whatever the case might be. So I think it is really good to be honest about how incredibly hard it is to get people. I recently ran a series of 6 workshops where we were going to open it to 20 people, and we ended up having a core group of like 8 folks for sure who would be there every time. And I think that was kind of what we saw here, is that we had a core group of people who, not just us 3, but who would be there always. And then some other folks who would come and go as their schedules allowed. And I would really like to have a further discussion about that, because I think that some of that was people who couldn't read and felt guilty, people who just were overwhelmed with their workload, people who were, you know, PS staff, professional services, maybe not feeling as flexible as academics, or vice versa. So I think there were maybe all sorts of reasons why we had this initial enthusiasm and then die off. And it isn't necessarily just, oh, you know, people got sick of being online. I think there are probably some complicated things there. And that really just brings us to the discussion. And I put the little graphic at the bottom because I think that it relates not just to what we were reading about in the book, but to what we were talking about in the sessions and what we were facing ourselves through this project of trying to be creative about how we approach these topics and the book club.
The aim of sort of EDI being involved with this, like it was touched on, is mainly to do with the Race Equality Charter and the university's commitment, which the VC has said openly and many times, to become an actively anti-racist institution. Now, the one issue with that is there's an awful lot of organizations and higher education institutions saying that they want to become an actively anti-racist institution, but nobody quite knows how. So This means that in some places there's maybe a little bit of stagnation. There's quite a lot of fear of doing the wrong thing, or not really maybe understanding what it means. People are sort of throwing race equality training at the problem. There are books. There's some great books. There's a great book called The Anti-Racist Institution, which is a great read. I think it's Shireen Daniels. And then there's also one which is Anti-Racism in Higher Education, but they're quite, the Anti-Racist Institution organization is quite a HR heavy book. And the Anti-Racism in Higher Education is very much an academic text. So although they're really interesting books, they're not nothing really out there, including Advanced HE, who administer the Race Equality Charter, and Athena Swan. There's a lot of reading, but there's not a lot of doing. There's a lot of talking, but there's not a lot of things happening. And so what I was really excited by when Sarah and I first started talking about this was, how can we make this into something that's anti-racist and actually mobilizes staff to support turning the organization into an anti-racist institution. And I think this has been such an interesting experiment, the slow book club concept, trying to use something around creativity. And I do think that the creativity, clarity, empathy triad really translates to EDI and the work that is done in EDI. And I think there's more for us to unpack there, and maybe with the EDI team and how we do our work. But moving forward from that meeting where nobody showed up, and it turned into a planning meeting, some really great ideas came out of it, because there will be another book club next year. We will continue. There is also anti-racism training that's in the pipeline. There is other initiatives from the team, but we really want to try and keep doing another iteration of this. Do something that's ever so slightly different, maybe schedule it different, or name it slightly differently, or just keep trying. And I think that is the key to race equity work. I think that's the key to anti-racism work, is just keep trying stuff. And then, right, okay, that bit didn't work, but let's try something else. And there's not quite enough of that. So what it's looking like for next year is a sort of an anti-racism community of practice concept, which will be made up of a number of elements. One will be an anti-racism slow book club, but maybe not as slow as we had it this year. Maybe we will spend 3 months on a text, but we'll also maybe look at shorter texts. One we're looking at is a book called Microactivism, which is all about, because I think people can be scared of how to be an activist, and so just trying to bring it down to a very small scale, what you can practically do. And that book club will be very much focused on educating white folks, really. So taking on that sort of labor of tackling people's white fragility, tackling people's understanding of privilege, and how they can step up and be an ally and an active anti-racist themselves. And maybe we will then look at movies and podcasts instead. Maybe books aren't the way to do it, so let's do it in another format. Have a podcast club instead. The second one, which I'm gonna talk with our staff network, who are rebranding, and their new name is going to be launched very soon, which is very exciting, and will really further this work as well, is a championing Black authors book club, which is open to everyone, but really gives an opportunity for our Black and racially minoritized staff and students to come along to a space where they're not expected to educate, where it's actually a celebration of people of color and what they've created. And so that's something that we're very conscious of, is we don't want these initiatives to become a burden, an emotional drain on our already overburdened minority ethnic staff. So we'll be looking at something like that, which will be quite celebratory, and will hopefully tie into educating around Black history and some things that people don't get educated about in the West very much. There'll also hopefully be a monthly bite-sized email. So very, very small. It'll have a quote, highlight an event, and something to read each month, to keep trying offer another opportunity for people to have something that's just quite small and that they can just dip in and out of, and help people feel engaged throughout the year. And as well as that, we have our student projects, which Kerry Deacon in the Education Incubator helps with, and also the Wellbeing, Inclusion, Culture Committee manager helps support. And those anti-racism student projects are brilliant, and they will continue to be funded for a number of years, and sort of looking at how we bring those into the community of practice and bring those into having support, but also education. So this has been a very interesting year. I think we've all learnt a lot. We're definitely not deterred. We're definitely going to continue, and hopefully reiterate into something that gives people tools to proactively go forth in their areas and teams and departments, and feel like we can start shaping the institution kind of from the bottom up.